Hey there, how's it going? Thanks for joining me today. Whether you're relaxing at home, on your commute, or winding down for the evening, I'm really glad you're here. I've been thinking about this incredible moment in history that almost happened differently. And when I say almost, I mean we were literally one signature away from living in a completely different world. Picture this. It's June 22nd, 1941, and Adolf Hitler is sitting in a bunker beneath East Prussia, staring at what might be the most consequential piece of paper in human history. The document in front of him contains the battle plans for Operation Barbarossa, Ravers TA, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union that would throw 4.3 million Axis troops across an 1,800-mile front. That's roughly the distance from New York to Denver, just to put that in perspective. 4.3 million soldiers. Think about that for a second. That's more people than live in Los Angeles. But here's the thing that absolutely blows my mind. In our story today, Hitler's pen never touches that paper. He never signs those orders. And that one moment of hesitation, that single decision, creates a butterfly effect that reshapes the entire Second World War and possibly the rest of human history. Now, I know what you're thinking. How could one decision change everything? Well, let me walk you through what was actually happening in that sweltering command bunker, where the fate of the world hung in the balance. The tension in that room must have been incredible. Picture Hitler, this man who had conquered most of Europe in just 2 years, suddenly facing his biggest gamble yet. On one side, he's got his obsession with destroying communism, this burning hatred of Stalin and everything the Soviet Union represents. On the other side, he's got some of his most experienced generals telling him this is military suicide. Heinz Guderian, the brilliant tank commander who had torn through France like a hot knife through butter, had been arguing against this invasion for weeks. Just days before this moment, he'd looked Hitler in the eye and said, "Mein Führer, we cannot fight on 2 fronts and expect to win." Can you imagine the courage that took? This is a man speaking truth to one of history's most dangerous dictators. And Guderian wasn't alone. Gerd von Rundstedt, one of Germany's most respected field marshals, had been making the same argument. These weren't politicians or yes-men. These were battle-hardened soldiers who understood what war actually costs. They could see what Hitler, in his megalomaniacal fever dreams, was missing. Here's what's wild about the whole situation. Britain was still fighting. The Battle of Britain had raged just months before, with German bombers trying to pound London into submission. The Royal Air Force had held on by their fingernails, and now Britain stood defiant, alone but unbroken. Churchill was preparing for a long war, gathering resources, rallying the Commonwealth. So imagine being one of Hitler's generals in that moment. You've got this incredibly dangerous enemy to your west who's already proven they won't give up, and now your leader wants to pick a fight with the massive Soviet Union to the east. It's like being in a bar fight with one tough guy and deciding to pick a fight with his even bigger friend at the same time. The numbers alone should have terrified anyone with a basic understanding of logistics. The Soviet Union wasn't some small European country that could be conquered in a few weeks. We're talking about a nation that stretched across 11 time zones. 11, when it's breakfast in Moscow, it's already dinner in Vladivostok. The sheer scale of what Hitler was proposing was mind-boggling. But here's where our alternate timeline begins. In our story, something makes Hitler pause. Maybe it's the exhaustion in Guderian's voice. Maybe it's the intelligence reports showing just how many tanks the Soviets actually have. And trust me, those numbers were staggering. Maybe it's just a moment of clarity breaking through his usual grandiose delusions. Whatever it is, in our timeline, Hitler sets down his pen. He looks at his generals and says something like, "Perhaps we should consider our other options first." Now, you might think this makes Hitler some kind of strategic genius in our alternate timeline. But here's the thing. This decision isn't about Hitler suddenly becoming reasonable. It's about him being just slightly less unreasonable at exactly the wrong moment in history. Because what happens next is going to be absolutely terrifying. Think about what Germany has accomplished by June 1941. In less than 2 years, they've conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France. France, the same country that held off Germany for 4 bloody years in World War I, fell in just 6 weeks. The German war machine seemed unstoppable, but here's what most people don't realize. Germany was running on fumes. Their economy was completely militarized, which means everything was geared toward producing weapons and keeping the army fed and supplied. They desperately needed resources, especially oil. Romania was helping, but it wasn't nearly enough. The German leadership knew they were in a race against time. In our real timeline, Hitler gambled everything on a quick victory over the Soviet Union. He figured 6 weeks, maybe 3 months tops, and he'd have access to Soviet oil, Ukrainian wheat, and millions of slaves to keep his war machine running. It was desperate, but it was a plan. In our alternate timeline, though, Hitler makes a different calculation. Instead of gambling everything on a massive invasion that could go catastrophically wrong, he decides to play it safe. And this is where things get really interesting, because playing it safe for Nazi Germany in 1941 doesn't mean peace. It means something potentially much worse. Picture what happens to those 4.3 million soldiers who were supposed to march into Russia. They don't just disappear. They're still there, still trained, still equipped, and now they're all concentrated in Western Europe with nothing to do but prepare for whatever comes next. The German Fourth Army, which historically got bogged down in the forests around Smolensk, remains in France. The Second Panzer Group, which should have been racing toward Moscow, stays put near the Atlantic Wall. Army Group Center, a massive force that historically bled out in the Russian winter, now has time to rest, refit, and prepare for other operations. And here's where Hitler's twisted mind starts working differently. If he's not going to attack Russia yet, then what else can he do to win this war? How can he force Britain to surrender? How can he convince America to stay out of the fight? The answer is going to transform the entire Passepartout European continent into something the world has never seen before. But before we get there, let me paint you a picture of just how close this alternate decision comes to reality. In actual history, there were delays in the Barbarossa timeline. Bad weather in the Balkans pushed the invasion back by several crucial weeks. Some historians argue that if Operation Barbarossa had started in May instead of June, Moscow might have fallen before winter. Others argue that any delay was actually helpful, because it gave German forces more time to prepare. But here's what's fascinating. There were real debates happening in the German High Command about whether this invasion was a good idea. Not moral debates, obviously, but strategic ones. Some generals worried about fighting a two-front war. Others questioned whether they had enough fuel and supplies for such a massive operation. Franz Halder, the German army's chief of staff, had serious concerns about the whole plan. He knew the logistics were going to be a nightmare. Wilhelm Keitel, Hitler's yes-man, was pushing for the invasion, but even he had moments of doubt about the timeline. So our alternate scenario isn't completely far-fetched. There was a window, a brief moment in time, where different advice or different circumstances could have changed Hitler's mind. And in that moment of hesitation, world history takes a completely different turn. Now, here's what I find absolutely chilling about this alternate timeline. By not invading Russia, Hitler doesn't become less dangerous. He becomes more dangerous. Because now, instead of scattering his forces across the vast Russian steppe, he can concentrate everything on creating the most formidable defensive position in human history. Remember, by summer 1941, Germany controls the Atlantic coastline from northern Norway all the way down to the Spanish border. That's about 3,000 miles of coastline. In our real timeline, they started building the T-Pretation, Atlantic Wall, to defend against Allied invasion, but they never had enough troops or resources to make it truly impregnable because so much was tied up in Russia. But in our alternate timeline, things are about to get very different. Picture Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and later armaments minister, getting a phone call in July 1941. Instead of being told to prepare for a campaign in Russia, he's told to turn all of Western Europe into an impregnable fortress. Not just the coastline, everything. Every mountain pass, every river crossing, every major city becomes a fortress within a fortress. The resources that historically went into Operation Barbarossa, as ACA, and we're talking about billions of dollars in today's money, now get redirected into the most ambitious construction project in human history. 3 million slave laborers who should have been building roads in Russia are instead digging bunkers in France. Steel that should have been replaced, destroyed. Tanks near Stalingrad is instead being poured into coastal fortifications. And here's the really terrifying part. Germany has time. In our real timeline, they were always racing against the clock, always one step away from complete collapse. But in our alternate timeline, they can take their time and do things right. By the end of 1941, as winter sets in across Europe, the first phase of Fortress Europe is already taking shape. Radar stations are sprouting along the coast like electronic flowers. Underground factories are being carved out of mountainsides. The English Channel is becoming the most dangerous body of water on Earth, but the fortress is just the beginning. Because while Hitler is turning Europe into an impregnable defensive position, he's also looking south toward a prize that could change everything: the oil fields of the Middle East and the strategic waterways that connect Europe, Africa, and Asia. This is where our story gets really wild. Because in our alternate timeline, instead of sending Erwin Rommel to North Africa with just 3 divisions and constant supply problems, Hitler is about to give him an entire army. And not just any army. He's about to give him the same forces that historically got trapped in the siege of Leningrad. Picture Rommel, the Desert Fox, getting word in August 1941 that instead of his small Africa Corps, he's about to receive massive reinforcements. The German 16th Army, which should have been fighting in the Baltic states, is being shipped to Libya. The 18th Army, which should have been besieging Leningrad, is being sent to Egypt, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we dive into Rommel's expanded desert campaign, before we explore the technological marvels that German scientists are about to create with unlimited resources, before we see how the resistance movements adapt to fighting a much stronger enemy, we need to understand what this moment, this single decision in that sweltering bunker, really means. It means that everything you think you know about World War II is about to change. The battles that defined a generation, the heroes and villains whose names echo through history, the very shape of the world we live in today, all of it hangs on this one moment when Hitler's pen hovers over a piece of paper and doesn't fall. And here's what gives me chills every time I think about it. We're not just talking about a different war, we're talking about a potentially different outcome. Because in our timeline, in the real world, the Allies won because Germany exhausted itself fighting on too many fronts. But what happens when Germany doesn't make that mistake? What happens when the full might of the Nazi war machine is focused and concentrated instead of scattered across a continent? That's the question that's going to haunt us through this entire story. Because while we know how World War II actually ended, we're about to explore a timeline where victory was far from certain, where the good guys might not have won, and where the world we know today might never have existed. The summer of 1941 is ending, and in our alternate timeline, instead of the sound of German tanks rolling toward Moscow, there's something else. The sound of concrete mixers and steel hammers, of radar stations humming to life, of ships carrying reinforcements not to the Russian front, but to the Mediterranean. The butterfly effect is about to begin in earnest, and trust me, you're not going to believe where this takes us. So here we are in our alternate timeline, and something absolutely extraordinary is about to unfold. Remember those 4.3 million German soldiers who should be marching toward Moscow? Well, they're still in Western Europe, and Hitler has just made a decision that's going to change the face of an entire continent. Picture this scene. It's early July 1941, and Albert Speer gets summoned to the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. Now, Speer is already Hitler's favorite architect, 12. This is the guy who designed those massive rally grounds in Nuremberg that could hold hundreds of thousands of people. But he's about to get the assignment of a lifetime. Hitler spreads out a map of Europe across his massive desk. And here's what he tells Speer. I want you to turn this entire continent into a fortress that cannot be breached. Not just the coastline, everything. Every kilometre from the Arctic Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. Can you imagine getting that assignment? Speer later wrote that he felt like he was being asked to rebuild the Roman Empire, except this time with concrete and steel instead of stone. And here's the crazy part. He actually has the resources to do it. In our real timeline, Germany was always scrambling to replace equipment lost on the Eastern Front. Tanks destroyed near Stalingrad, trucks abandoned in Russian mud, fuel burned, crossing endless steppes. But in our alternate world, none of that is happening. Every piece of steel, every gallon of fuel, every engineering unit that should have been lost in Russia is instead available for this massive construction project. Let me paint you a picture of what starts happening across Europe in the summer and fall of 1941. First, Speer divides the continent into defensive zones. The Atlantic Wall, which in our timeline was just a series of beach fortifications, becomes the outer ring of something much more comprehensive. From the fjords of Norway down to the Bay of Biscay, construction crews start working around the clock. But here's what's different. They're not just building bunkers on the beaches. They're creating defense in depth. That means every 20 to 30 kilometers inland, there's another line of fortifications. Roads, railways, even small villages become part of this defensive network. The numbers are staggering. In our real timeline, the Germans built about 15,000 bunkers and strongpoints along the Atlantic Wall over 3 years. In our alternate timeline, they're building 15,000 bunkers just in the first 6 months, and that's just the beginning. Think about the logistics for a second. To build one of these massive concrete bunkers, 2 ISLF, and we're talking about structures with walls 6 feet thick, you need about 500 tons of concrete. That's the weight of about 250 cars. Now multiply that by 15,000 bunkers, and you start to get a sense of the scale we're talking about. But concrete is just the beginning. Each bunker needs steel reinforcement, ventilation systems, communication equipment, ammunition storage, sleeping quarters for the crew. The German Engineering Corps, which should have been building bridges over Russian rivers, is instead designing the most sophisticated defensive network in human history. And here's where it gets really interesting. They have time to do it right. In our real timeline, the Atlantic Wall was always a rush job because resources kept getting diverted to other fronts. But in our alternate world, this is the priority. Every engineer, every construction crew, every logistics expert is focused on one goal: making Europe unconquerable. Let me walk you through what a typical section of this new fortress Europe looks like by the end of 1941. You're approaching the French coast from the English Channel. 20 miles out to sea, German U-boats and surface patrols start tracking you. 15 miles out, long-range coastal artillery can reach you. Guns so massive they can throw a shell weighing as much as a small car. At 10 miles out, you enter the radar detection zone. Now, radar in 1941 isn't what we think of today, but the Germans are building these massive stations every 20 miles along the coast. Each one can track aircraft or ships for dozens of miles. There's nowhere to hide. At 5 miles out, you're in range of the medium-range coastal guns. These aren't just single batteries. They're integrated fire control systems where multiple gun positions can concentrate their fire on a single target. The mathematics of destruction, calculated with German precision. At 2 miles out, you hit the outer obstacle belt. Underwater mines, steel hedgehogs, concrete dragon's teeth designed to rip the bottom out of any landing craft. And all of this is just the beginning. The beach itself has become a killing field. Machine gun nests positioned so they can provide overlapping fields of fire. Mortar positions hidden in reinforced bunkers. Anti-tank guns that can destroy any vehicle the Allies might try to land. And behind all of this, the massive bunkers housing the heavy artillery. But here's what's really revolutionary about Fortress Europe. It doesn't stop at the beach. In our real timeline, if you got off the beach, you had a fighting chance. Not in our alternate world. Every village, every crossroads, every bridge has been turned into a defensive position. The German engineers have studied every invasion in history, and they've learned from all of them. They know that attackers need to establish a beachhead, bring in supplies, and then break out into the countryside. So they've made each of these steps exponentially more difficult. Picture trying to land supplies on a beach where every approach is covered by artillery. Picture trying to move inland when every road has been prepared for demolition and every intersection has a bunker. Picture trying to maintain momentum when you're constantly running into new defensive lines that seem to stretch forever. And here's the part that would have given Allied planners nightmares. The Germans have mobile reserves positioned behind all of these static defenses. Remember those panzer divisions that should have been fighting around Moscow? They're now stationed in central France, ready to race to any threatened section of the coast. The German doctrine becomes simple and terrifying. Let the enemy come ashore, then crush them between the prepared defences and the mobile counterattack. It's like a massive steel trap, and by early 1942, it's almost ready to snap shut. But the fortress isn't just about stopping invasions from the sea. Speer and his engineers are thinking three-dimensionally. They're building underground. Beneath the Pyrenees Mountains, between France and Spain, massive tunnels are being carved out of solid rock. These aren't just hiding places, they're underground factories. Picture this. While Allied bombers are pounding German surface facilities, production is continuing in factories that are literally inside mountains. Aircraft engines, tank parts, ammunition, RBA, all being manufactured in facilities that are essentially immune to air attack. The rail network gets rebuilt too, but not the way you might expect. Instead of running trains on the surface where they can be bombed, the Germans start building underground rail lines. By 1943, you could travel from Berlin to Paris entirely underground. Supplies, troops, equipment, OIEAATA, all moving through a network that's invisible from the air. Communication systems get the same treatment. Instead of radio towers that can be knocked out by bombing, the Germans string cables through these underground networks, command and control systems that can't be disrupted by anything short of a direct nuclear hit. And speaking of command and control, here's something that would have blown the minds of Allied intelligence officers. Germans are pioneering early forms of computer-assisted fire control. They're taking the mechanical calculating devices they've developed and networking them together so that coastal artillery batteries can coordinate their fire with unprecedented precision. By the spring of 1942, test firings are achieving something unprecedented. Multiple gun batteries, separated by dozens of miles, can put shells within 50 meters of the same target simultaneously. It's like the entire coastline has become one giant weapon system. The human cost of all this construction is staggering and horrific. 3 million forced labourers, IA, prisoners of war, political prisoners, people rounded up from across occupied Europe, are working in conditions that can only be described as hellish. The mortality rate is appalling, but from the Nazi perspective, that's just the cost of building their fortress. But here's what makes this even more chilling. The Germans are learning as they build. Every month, the designs get more sophisticated. Bunkers that were state-of-the-art in July are being improved by October. New techniques for camouflage, better ventilation systems, more efficient ammunition storage. And they're not just copying existing designs. German engineers are inventing new forms of fortification. Self-contained bunker, complexes that can operate independently for months. Defensive positions that can retract underground when under bombardment, and then emerge to fight again. It's military engineering on a scale and sophistication that the world has never seen. By the end of 1942, British reconnaissance flights are bringing back photographs that honestly don't look real. The entire European coastline appears to be one continuous fortification. Gun positions, radar stations, bunker complexes, BPAP, all connected by communication networks and supply tunnels. And here's the nightmare scenario that's keeping Allied leaders awake at night. They're not done. Every month that passes makes Fortress Europe stronger. Every new defensive innovation gets incorporated into the design. Every lesson learned from combat elsewhere gets applied to making the fortress more deadly. Winston Churchill, looking at intelligence reports in late 1942, makes a comment that chills everyone in the room. "Gentlemen, I fear we may have waited too long. This fortress may be too strong to break." But even as Fortress Europe rises from the landscape like some technological nightmare, other events are unfolding that will reshape the entire war. Because while millions of workers are building bunkers in France, German armies are about to embark on campaigns that will threaten the very foundations of the British Empire. The fortress is nearly complete, but the war is far from over. In fact, in some ways, it's just beginning. While concrete bunkers are rising along the Atlantic coast, something else is happening that's going to shake the foundations of the British Empire. Remember, in our alternate timeline, Hitler has just freed up massive military resources by not invading Russia. And now he's looking south toward one of the greatest strategic prizes in the world, the oil fields of the Middle East. Picture this scene. It's August 1941, and Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, is sitting in his headquarters in Libya reading the most incredible set of orders he's ever received. Instead of his small Africa Corps with its constant supply problems, he's about to command an entire army group. We're talking about forces that historically were tied down, besieging Leningrad and fighting in the Baltic states. Now, here's what makes this absolutely mind-blowing. Rommel in our real timeline managed to threaten Egypt with just 3 divisions and chronic shortages of everything. He was always running out of fuel, ammunition, spare parts. His supply line stretched back across the Mediterranean to Italy, then by truck across hundreds of miles of desert. It was a logistical nightmare. But in our alternate world, things are about to get very different. The German 16th Army, which should have been fighting in Estonia, is instead boarding ships in Italian ports. The 18th Army, which should have been trapped in the siege of Leningrad, is being transported to North Africa. The 4th Panzer Group, which historically got bogged down in Russian mud, is being equipped for desert warfare. Let me put this in perspective for you. In our real timeline, Rommel had about 50,000 troops at his peak strength. In our alternate timeline, he's about to command over 300,000. That's not just a bigger force, that's a completely different kind of military operation. The logistics alone are staggering. To supply 50,000 troops in North Africa required dozens of ships making dangerous runs across the Mediterranean. To supply 300,000 requires something approaching a military sea lift on the scale of D-Day, except it's happening in reverse and it's being done by the Germans. But here's where German efficiency really shows itself. The lessons learned from the French campaign, from the conquest of the Low Countries, from the invasion of Norway, APAT, all of that experience is being applied to desert warfare. Picture German engineers arriving in Libya in September 1941, and immediately beginning the most ambitious construction project in African history. They're not just building supply depots, they're building a railway. Not some makeshift military railroad, but a proper double-tracked line running from the ports of Libya all the way to the Egyptian border and beyond. In our real timeline, Rommel's supplies came by truck convoy across hundreds of miles of desert road. Trucks break down, trucks get bombed, trucks run out of fuel. But a railway? That's a different story entirely. By the time this rail line is complete, German forces can move supplies from Tripoli to the front lines in Egypt in a matter of hours instead of days. And here's the really clever part. They're not just building one rail line, they're building multiple lines running parallel to each other. So if the British bomb one track, supplies can still flow on the others. It's redundancy, built into the very infrastructure of the campaign. But the railway is just the beginning. German engineers are also building something unprecedented in desert warfare, one pipeline. One of the biggest problems for any army in North Africa is water. Troops can survive without food for days, but without water in the desert, you're dead in hours. The Germans solve this by constructing a pipeline system that brings fresh water from underground sources hundreds of miles away. By early 1942, German forces in Egypt have more reliable access to fresh water than some cities in Europe. It's military engineering on a scale that makes you understand why the German army was so feared. Now, let's talk about what happens when this massively reinforced Afrika Korps actually goes into action. The British 8th Army, commanded by Claude Auchinleck, is designed to fight against Rommel's historical 3 divisions. They've got about 100,000 troops, which seemed adequate for the threat they were facing. But suddenly, Instead of facing 3 German divisions, they're facing 15. Instead of fighting against 50,000 troops, they're up against 300,000. Instead of dealing with a few hundred German tanks, they're facing over 2,000. The mathematics of desert warfare shift completely. In our real timeline, battles in North Africa were often decided by who could maintain their supply lines and keep their tanks running. But when one side has overwhelming numerical superiority and perfect logistics, those calculations become meaningless. Picture the scene in October 1941 as this massive German force launches its offensive. The British have prepared defensive positions around Tobruk and along the Egyptian border. These fortifications held against historical Rommel, but they were designed for a much smaller attacking force. When 2,000 German tanks, supported by Stuka dive bombers and massive artillery concentrations, hit these positions, it's not really a battle. It's more like a demonstration of what happens when overwhelming force meets inadequate preparation. By the end of October, German panzers are rolling through the streets of Alexandria. By November, they're approaching Cairo. The British Mediterranean fleet has to evacuate to the Red Sea to avoid being trapped. The Suez Canal, UCE, the lifeline of the British Empire, TP2, falls under German control. But here's where things get really wild. In our real timeline, this would have been the end of the North African campaign. But in our alternate world, this is just the beginning. Because now German forces have access to something that changes everything: Middle Eastern oil. Picture German engineers in December 1941 surveying the oil fields of Iraq and Saudi Arabia. These aren't just any oil fields, these are some of the richest petroleum deposits in the world. In our real timeline, these resources powered the Allied war effort. In our alternate timeline, they're about to power the German war machine. The strategic implications are absolutely staggering. Germany's chronic fuel shortage, which historically limited their operations, suddenly disappears. Those panzer divisions that had to conserve fuel for critical operations now have virtually unlimited mobility. The Luftwaffe, which had to ration fuel for training and operations, can suddenly fly as many missions as they have pilots for. But oil is just part of the prize. Control of the Middle East also means control of the sea routes between Europe, Africa, and Asia. British shipping between India and Britain, which historically went around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, now has to take much longer routes to avoid German-controlled waters. And here's where the global implications start to become clear. India, the crown jewel of the British Empire, is suddenly much more isolated. British troops that should have been reinforcing Egypt are now trapped in India. Indian resources that should have been flowing to Britain are cut off. But we're not done yet, because while German forces are consolidating their control over the Middle East, something else is happening that's going to shake the entire global balance of power. In the Pacific, Japanese forces are watching these German successes with great interest. In our real timeline, Japan and Germany were allies, but they operated in completely separate spheres. The Germans were focused on Europe and North Africa, while the Japanese concentrated on the Pacific and Southeast Asia. But in our alternate timeline, suddenly there's an opportunity for coordination that didn't exist before. German forces controlling the Middle East and the Arabian Sea can potentially link up with Japanese forces advancing through Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. Picture this scene. It's early 1942, and German U-boats are operating out of bases in the Persian Gulf, while Japanese submarines prowl the Bay of Bengal. The Indian Ocean, historically controlled by the British Royal Navy, becomes a hunting ground for Axis submarines. But the real game changer comes when German and Japanese staffs start coordinating their operations. What if, instead of separate campaigns, they launched a coordinated assault on British India? German forces attacking from the west through Afghanistan and Pakistan, while Japanese forces attack from the east through Burma and Bengal. The British Indian Army, which historically held off Japanese attacks from Burma, suddenly faces the nightmare scenario of fighting on 2 fronts simultaneously. And unlike Europe, where difficult terrain and harsh weather might slow down attackers, much of northern India is perfect tank country. By March 1942, something unprecedented happens. German and Japanese officers meet in the port city of Dantemtiopers. Karachi, now under Axis control. They're not just coordinating separate operations, CRT, they're planning joint operations on a scale that the world has never seen. Picture German Tiger tanks and Japanese Type 97 tanks advancing together across the plains of northern India. Picture Luftwaffe Stukas and Japanese Zero fighters providing close air support for the same ground operations. Picture combined German-Japanese task forces controlling the shipping lanes that historically supplied British forces throughout Asia. The British Empire, which has dominated global commerce and naval power for over 200 years, suddenly finds itself facing a coordinated challenge from two directions simultaneously. And unlike previous conflicts where Britain could rely on its naval superiority to maintain communications with its far-flung empire, now those sea lanes are under constant attack. Churchill, receiving reports of these developments in the spring of 1942, makes a comment that reveals just how desperate the situation has become. Gentlemen, we may be witnessing the end of the empire as we know it. But even as German and Japanese forces are reshaping the balance of power in Asia and the Middle East, other developments are unfolding that will determine whether this alternate timeline leads to Axis victory or eventual Allied recovery. Because while German armies are advancing across desert sands and Japanese fleets are controlling tropical seas, scientists in hidden laboratories are racing to develop weapons that could change the nature of warfare itself. The global chessboard has been completely rearranged, but the game is far from over. Now we come to the part of our story that honestly gives me chills every time I think about it. Because while German armies are conquering the Middle East and building impregnable fortresses across Europe, something else is happening in secret laboratories and underground facilities that could have changed the entire course of human history. Picture this scene. It's September 1941, and Werner von Braun is standing in the underground complex at Peenemünde, looking at rocket blueprints that seem like something out of science fiction. In our real timeline, von Braun's team was always struggling with limited resources, constantly having their funding diverted to more immediate military needs. But in our alternate world, where Germany isn't bleeding resources into the Russian campaign, everything has changed. Here's what's wild about this. Von Braun and his team already had the basic technology for intercontinental ballistic missiles in 1941. The V-2 rocket, which historically terrorized London in 1944 and 1945, was really just a proof of concept. The German rocket scientists understood the principles for building much larger, much more powerful rockets. They just never had the resources to build them. But now they do. Let me walk you through what starts happening at Peenemünde and other secret facilities across Germany. Instead of building 800 V-2 rockets over 2 years, like they did historically, German factories are now producing 8,000. But that's just the beginning, because the V-2 was never intended to be the end goal, ICT. It was just the first step. Picture German engineers in late 1941 working on designs for the A-10 rocket. This isn't some incremental improvement over the V-2. This is a monster. We're talking about a rocket that stands 12 stories tall and can carry a warhead weighing 5 tons across 3,000 miles. 3,000 miles. That's the distance from Berlin to New York City. In our real timeline, these rockets remained on the drawing board because Germany could never spare the resources to build them. But in our alternate world, by summer 1942, the first A-10 rockets are rolling out of underground factories in the Harz mountains. And here's where things get really terrifying. These aren't just bigger versions of existing weapons. German scientists are developing guidance systems that make these rockets accurate enough to hit specific buildings from thousands of miles away. We're talking about technology that in our real timeline didn't exist until the 1960s. But rockets are just one part of the technological revolution that's happening in our alternate Germany. In hidden laboratories beneath the Bavarian Alps, other teams are working on projects that sound like they're straight out of a fantasy novel. Let's talk about German jet aircraft development. In our real timeline, the Germans fielded the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, in late 1944. But by then, They were so short of fuel and experienced pilots that these revolutionary aircraft had minimal impact on the war. In our alternate timeline, the first Me-262 squadrons are operational by early 1943, and they're not struggling with fuel shortages because Germany now controls Middle Eastern oil fields. Picture Allied bomber crews over Germany suddenly encountering aircraft that can fly 200 miles per hour faster than anything they've ever seen. But the Me-262 is just the beginning. German engineers, with unlimited resources and no pressure to rush inferior designs into production, are developing jet aircraft that are genuinely decades ahead of anything the Allies have. By 1944, German jets are flying at speeds approaching 700 miles per hour and altitudes above 50,000 feet. Here's what that means in practical terms. Allied bombers, flying at 25,000 feet and maybe 300 miles per hour, become sitting ducks. The strategic bombing campaign that historically brought Germany to its knees becomes impossible to sustain. But even more revolutionary, developments are happening in fields that most people have never heard of. German scientists are pioneering early forms of radar-guided anti-aircraft weapons. Picture this. Allied bomber formations approaching German targets suddenly face surface-to-air missiles that can track and destroy individual aircraft with near-perfect accuracy. These aren't the crude, unguided rockets that Germany used historically. These are sophisticated weapons systems with electronic guidance, proximity fuses, and enough explosive power to destroy a heavy bomber with a single hit. By late 1943, flying over Germany becomes essentially suicidal for Allied aircrews. And then there's the development that keeps me awake at night when I think about this alternate timeline, the German nuclear program. In our real timeline, Werner Heisenberg and the German atomic research team made several crucial mistakes and never came close to building a functional nuclear weapon. Partly this was due to limited resources, partly due to theoretical errors, and partly due to the chaotic nature of the Nazi research establishment. But in our alternate world, things develop very differently. Picture Heisenberg in early 1942, receiving a virtually unlimited budget and being told that atomic research is now Germany's highest priority. Picture him working with a team of scientists who aren't constantly being interrupted by the demands of conventional weapons production. Here's what's really chilling. In our alternate timeline, German scientists have access to something they lacked historically: unlimited electricity. The hydroelectric plants of occupied Norway, the coal plants of occupied Poland, the oil-fired generators powered by Middle Eastern petroleum, i.e., all of this electrical capacity can be dedicated to the massive power requirements of uranium enrichment. By summer 1943, the first German nuclear reactor achieves critical mass in an underground facility, beneath the Thuringian forest. By fall, German scientists are producing weapons-grade uranium. By winter, they're designing the mechanisms for an atomic bomb. Now, I want to be clear about something. AAC. This isn't inevitable. Nuclear weapons development is incredibly complex, and even with unlimited resources, there are countless technical challenges. But in our alternate timeline, German scientists have something they didn't have historically: time. They can afford to make mistakes, learn from them, and try again. Picture this scene. It's March 1944, and somewhere in the German-controlled Sahara Desert, the world's first atomic bomb test takes place. The flash of light is visible for hundreds of miles. The mushroom cloud rises into the stratosphere, and suddenly, the entire strategic balance of the war shifts again. But nuclear weapons aren't the only revolutionary technology being developed in our alternate Germany. German engineers are also pioneering early forms of guided missiles, primitive computers for fire control systems, and even experimental television-guided bombs. Here's something that would have blown Allied minds. By 1944, German U-boats are operating with primitive sonar systems that can track ships from dozens of miles away. German aircraft are equipped with radar that can see through clouds and darkness. German artillery can hit targets with accuracy that seems almost supernatural. The technological gap between Germany and the Allies, which in our real timeline was closing by 1944, in our alternate world keeps widening. Every month brings new innovations, new weapons systems, new capabilities that make Allied victory seem increasingly impossible. But here's where things get really science fiction-esque. German scientists, working with Japanese researchers who have been brought to European laboratories, begin developing what they call wonder weapons, revolutionary technologies that could change warfare forever. Picture German factories in 1945 producing what they call robot bombs, unmanned aircraft that can fly themselves to targets hundreds of miles away and deliver explosives with pinpoint accuracy. Picture German submarines launching missiles from underwater that can surface, fly through the air, and hit ships beyond the horizon. By the time our alternate 1945 arrives, German technology is operating on a level that, in our real timeline, wouldn't be achieved until the 1960s or 70s. Jet aircraft that can break the sound barrier, rockets that can put satellites into orbit, electronic systems that can guide weapons with computer-like precision. And here's the most chilling part of all. This technological revolution isn't just about building better weapons. It's about creating weapons that make conventional military operations obsolete. Why invade Britain when you can destroy every major city with rockets launched from the continent? Why fight tank battles when you can disable enemy armor with electronic weapons? The nature of warfare itself is changing, and Germany is leading that change. But even as German scientists are developing weapons that seem like magic, other forces are at work that could still change the outcome of this alternate war. Because while laboratories produce technological marvels, real wars are still fought by real people who refuse to give up, even when the odds seem impossible. The hidden war of resistance and sabotage is about to enter a new and deadlier phase. You know what's incredible about human nature? Even when facing impossible odds, even when confronted by overwhelming technological superiority and seemingly unbreakable fortresses, people find ways to fight back. And in our alternate timeline, as Nazi Germany grows stronger and more technologically advanced, the shadow war of resistance becomes more desperate, more innovative, and more crucial than ever. Picture this scene. It's October 1942, and Jean Moulin, the legendary leader of the French resistance, is meeting with British Special Operations executive agents in a hidden cellar beneath a bakery in Lyon. But the conversation they're having would have been unthinkable in our real timeline. In our actual history, the French resistance was fighting against a German occupation force that was constantly being drained by the demands of the Eastern Front. German troops in France were often older reservists, poorly equipped units, or forces recovering from combat in Russia. But in our alternate world, the resistance faces something much more formidable. Picture Jean Moulin spreading out reconnaissance photographs on a wooden table, and these images show something that makes everyone in that cellar go quiet. Instead of the relatively light German presence that existed historically, France is now garrisoned by some of Germany's best troops, units that should have been fighting around Moscow, but are instead conducting anti-partisan operations with ruthless efficiency. Here's what makes this so much more dangerous. These German forces aren't exhausted from months of combat in terrible conditions. They're fresh, well-supplied, and they have time to focus entirely on crushing resistance activities. The cat-and-mouse game between occupiers and resistance has become exponentially more deadly. But here's the thing about resistance movements, IDI. They adapt. They have to. So as German security measures become more sophisticated, resistance tactics evolve in response. In our alternate timeline, instead of just gathering intelligence and conducting small-scale sabotage, the resistance networks are becoming something approaching shadow armies. Let me tell you about Marie-Madeleine Fourcade and her Alliance network. In our real timeline, Alliance was one of the most effective intelligence networks in occupied France, providing crucial information to the British about German defences and troop movements. But in our alternate world, Alliance faces challenges that would have destroyed lesser organisations. Picture Fourcade receiving reports in late 1942 that German security forces have tripled their counterintelligence efforts. Instead of having to worry about periodic sweeps and random searches, her agents now face constant surveillance by Gestapo units that have nothing else to do but hunt resistance fighters. The traditional methods of resistance, AAG, dead drops, coded radio messages, safe houses, the stand, suddenly become much more dangerous when the occupying forces have unlimited time and resources to dedicate to security operations. So the resistance innovates. Here's what's brilliant about what happens next. Resistance networks across Europe start coordinating in ways that never occurred historically. British Special Operations Executive doesn't just work with French resistance groups. They're now facilitating communication between resistance movements from Norway to Greece. Picture this network. Polish Home Army intelligence flows to French resistance cells, which pass it to Dutch underground networks, which relay it to British intelligence services. It's like a vast nervous system stretching across occupied Europe, carrying information faster than German counterintelligence can react. But intelligence gathering is just part of the story. The resistance also has to adapt its sabotage tactics to deal with much more heavily defended targets. In our real timeline, blowing up a railway bridge might shut down a supply line for days. In our alternate world, where Germany has built redundant transportation networks and massive engineering capabilities, the same bridge gets repaired in hours. So resistance groups start thinking bigger. Instead of attacking individual targets, they begin coordinating simultaneous attacks across multiple locations. Picture this. On the same night in March 1943, resistance fighters strike railway lines in 15 different locations across France, communication towers in 10 Dutch cities, and supply depots in 7 Norwegian towns. The Germans can repair any individual target quickly, but repairing dozens of targets simultaneously, that stretches even their impressive engineering capabilities. But the resistance faces another challenge that didn't exist in our real timeline: German technological superiority. Picture Dutch resistance fighters trying to guide Allied bombers to hidden radar installations, except now those installations are protected by early warning systems that can detect approaching aircraft from hundreds of miles away. Traditional resistance tactics, ATM, lighting signal fires, using flashlights to mark targets, become useless when German forces have night vision equipment and electronic surveillance systems. So, once again, the resistance adapts. Here's where things get really innovative. Resistance groups start developing their own technological capabilities. British SOE begins supplying resistance networks with early radio equipment that can't be detected by German direction-finding systems. French resistance cells start using captured German equipment against its former owners. Picture Marie-Madeleine Fourcade's agents in early 1943 using captured German radio sets to send false information to German forces, coordinating fake troop movements that draw defenders away from real targets. It's psychological warfare, conducted by people who officially don't exist. But the most remarkable adaptation happens in Poland, where the Home Army faces perhaps the most difficult situation of any resistance movement. Poland is closer to German population centres, more thoroughly occupied, and subject to more intensive security measures than anywhere else in Europe. But here's what the Polish resistance does that's absolutely brilliant. They go underground. Not metaphorically, but literally. Using Warsaw's sewer system, abandoned subway tunnels, and natural caves, they create an entire parallel city beneath the occupied surface. Picture this underground network. Hidden printing presses producing newspapers and propaganda, secret schools teaching Polish history and culture, medical facilities treating wounded resistance fighters, and weapons caches supplied by British airdrops. It's like a shadow Poland existing beneath the German occupation. And here's what makes this even more remarkable. This underground network isn't just hiding from the Germans, it's actively undermining their control. Polish resistance fighters emerge from sewers to strike German patrols, then disappear back underground before reinforcements can arrive. But perhaps the most crucial role of the resistance in our alternate timeline is something that wouldn't become obvious until much later. They're gathering intelligence about those revolutionary German weapons systems we talked about in the last chapter. Picture French resistance agents near Peenemünde photographing rocket tests and smuggling those photographs to British intelligence. Picture Norwegian resistance fighters monitoring German heavy water production facilities and reporting any increases in activity. Picture Dutch agents tracking the movement of unusual equipment toward underground facilities. This intelligence becomes absolutely crucial, because in our alternate timeline, where Germany's technological advantage keeps growing, the Allies desperately need to understand what they're facing. Every photograph of a new German jet aircraft, every report of a successful rocket test, every observation of unusual construction activity becomes a piece of a puzzle that Allied intelligence is frantically trying to solve. But the resistance pays a terrible price for gathering this information. German security forces, with more resources and better technology than they had historically, conduct counterintelligence operations that devastate resistance networks. Entire cells are rolled up, safe houses are compromised, and resistance leaders are captured and executed. The mathematics of resistance warfare shift dramatically. In our real timeline, resistance groups could afford to lose some agents because German security forces were overstretched and often incompetent. In our alternate world, every operation becomes a potential death sentence, and every agent who's captured represents the loss of months or years of careful network building. But here's what's remarkable about the human spirit. Even under these impossible conditions, resistance continues. New networks replace destroyed ones. New leaders emerge when old ones are captured. New tactics develop to replace compromised methods. By 1944, resistance movements across Europe have evolved into something unprecedented in military history: coordinated underground armies capable of conducting operations that tie down hundreds of thousands of German troops who should be defending against Allied invasion. Picture this scene. D-Day is approaching in our alternate timeline, except it's not the D-Day we know from history. Allied forces facing Fortress Europe need every possible advantage, and resistance networks provide crucial support by conducting the largest coordinated sabotage operation in history. On the night before the invasion, resistance fighters across Europe strike simultaneously. Railway lines are cut, communication cables are severed, radar installations are destroyed, and supply convoys are ambushed. It's not enough to break Fortress Europe, but it's enough to create chaos behind German lines at the crucial moment. But even as resistance fighters are preparing for what might be their final operations, larger forces are reshaping the global balance of power. The diplomatic chess game between the major powers is about to enter its most complex and dangerous phase. Here's where our alternate timeline gets really wild, because while armies are fighting and scientists are developing revolutionary weapons, the real battle for the future of the world is being fought in conference rooms and hidden meetings between the most powerful leaders on Earth. And trust me, the diplomatic maneuvering that's about to unfold is more complex and high stakes than any military campaign. Picture this scene. It's November 1942, and Joseph Stalin is pacing his office in the Kremlin at 3 in the morning. Maps cover every wall, showing German fortifications across Europe, Axis advances in the Middle East, and the growing technological gap between Germany and everyone else. The man who expected to be fighting German invaders on Soviet soil is instead facing a nightmare scenario he never prepared for. Here's what's keeping Stalin awake. Intelligence reports that paint a picture of German strength that gets more terrifying every month. Instead of German armies bleeding themselves, white in Russian snow, they're growing stronger. Instead of German industry collapsing under the strain of a two-front war, it's accelerating technological development that could make conventional military force obsolete. Stalin faces the ultimate strategic dilemma. Every month he waits, Germany gets stronger. Every month he hesitates. Those rockets get more accurate, those jet fighters get faster, and those atomic scientists get closer to building weapons that could incinerate Moscow in a single flash. But here's the terrifying calculus Stalin has to make. If he attacks Germany now, while they're still building their fortress, he might be able to break through. But if he waits much longer, Fortress Europe might become genuinely impregnable, and those wonder weapons might make conventional invasion impossible. Picture Stalin calling a meeting of his top military advisors in December 1942. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the hero of the defense of Moscow in our real timeline, is studying intelligence photographs of German fortifications and shaking his head. "Comrade Stalin," he says, "we may have already waited too long." The numbers Zhukov presents are sobering. To breach the German defensive lines now would require at least 3 million Soviet troops and probably cost 1 million casualties. But to wait another year? The casualties could be twice that, assuming conventional attack is even possible against weapons that seem like science fiction. But Stalin isn't the only world leader facing impossible choices. Across the Atlantic, Franklin Roosevelt is dealing with his own nightmare scenario. American intelligence services are providing him with reports about German technological developments that sound like they're straight out of Buck Rogers comic strips. Picture Roosevelt meeting with his scientific advisors in early 1943, and they're telling him things that seem impossible. German rockets that can reach American cities, German submarines that can stay underwater for weeks at a time, German aircraft that can fly faster than sound. Here's what's really terrifying Roosevelt, TAA, America's industrial advantage, which historically won the war, suddenly doesn't matter if German technology makes American weapons obsolete. What good are 10,000 tanks if German jet aircraft can destroy them from altitudes American fighters can't reach? Roosevelt faces his own terrible calculation. America has been preparing for war in Europe, but the Europe they've been preparing to invade no longer exists. Fortress Europe isn't the continent that American forces liberated in our real timeline, MSA. It's something entirely new and much more dangerous. And then there's Winston Churchill, who's facing perhaps the most desperate situation of all. The British Empire, which has dominated global trade and naval power for 2 centuries, is falling apart. German control of the Middle East has cut Britain off from India. Axis submarines in the Indian Ocean have made the traditional sea routes too dangerous to use. Picture Churchill in his war room beneath London in January 1943, staring at a map that shows the shrinking extent of effective British control. Canada and Australia are still secure, but India is increasingly isolated. Africa is threatened from the north, and even the Atlantic shipping lanes are becoming more dangerous as German U-boats operate with near impunity. But here's where the diplomatic chess game gets really complex, tension. Each of these leaders is not just planning their own strategy, but trying to figure out what the others are going to do. And the alliance between Britain, America, and the Soviet Union, which held together historically because they all faced immediate German threats, is starting to strain under very different pressures. Stalin knows that if he attacks Germany alone, he'll face the full might of Fortress Europe without significant help from the Western allies. But he also knows that if he waits for Britain and America to organize their own invasion, Germany might become too strong for anyone to defeat. Roosevelt wants to coordinate with Stalin for a simultaneous attack on Germany from east and west, but American military advisors are telling him that crossing the Atlantic to attack Fortress Europe could cost 2 million American lives. Those are numbers that could destroy his presidency and turn American public opinion against the war entirely. Churchill desperately needs American and Soviet help to prevent the complete collapse of the British Empire, but he's also terrified that a Soviet victory over Germany could leave communist forces in control of all of Europe. From Churchill's perspective, German domination might be preferable to Soviet domination, and here's where things get really complicated. Secret diplomatic contacts start happening between the major powers that would have been unthinkable in our real timeline. Picture this scene. In March 1943, a Swiss businessman arrives in Stockholm carrying messages between German and British representatives. The conversations that follow are among the most sensitive in diplomatic history because they involve the possibility of a separate peace between Britain and Germany. The German proposal is superficially attractive. Britain keeps its empire in exchange for recognizing German control of continental Europe. No more bombing of British cities, no more submarine warfare against British shipping, no more threat to the home islands. Germany gets a free hand in Europe and Russia. Britain gets to maintain its global empire. Churchill faces an agonizing decision. Accepting this deal would save millions of British lives and preserve the empire. But it would also abandon the Soviet Union to face Germany alone, and it would leave Germany free to develop those revolutionary weapons without interference. But even more sensitive negotiations are happening between Germany and the Soviet Union. Picture secret meetings in Finland between German and Soviet representatives, discussing the possibility of a new non-aggression pact that would divide Europe between Nazi and communist spheres of influence. For Stalin, this would solve his immediate strategic problem. Later it would prevent a German attack on the Soviet Union, while giving him time to develop his own advanced weapons. For Germany, it would eliminate the threat of a two-front war and allow them to concentrate entirely on dealing with Britain and America. Here's what makes these negotiations so chilling. They're not happening because the leaders involved like each other or share common values. They're happening because each side is calculating that they might be better off making a deal with their enemies than fighting a war they might not be able to win. But while political leaders are exploring diplomatic options, military realities are creating their own momentum. American preparations for an invasion of Europe are too advanced to stop easily. Soviet military mobilization is creating facts on the ground that make peace negotiations increasingly difficult. And there's another factor that's influencing all of these calculations. None of these leaders fully understands how advanced German weapons development has actually become. They know Germany is developing new technologies, but they don't know about the atomic research facilities in the Harz Mountains or the intercontinental rocket programs at Peenemünde. Picture Roosevelt receiving intelligence reports in spring 1943 suggesting that Germany might have nuclear weapons within a year. Suddenly, all the diplomatic and military calculations change. If Germany gets atomic bombs first, conventional military force becomes meaningless. The nation that controls atomic weapons controls the world. This realization creates a new urgency in Allied planning. Instead of debating whether to invade Europe, the question becomes whether they can invade before German wonder weapons make invasion impossible. Instead of negotiating for better terms, the focus shifts to preventing Germany from achieving technological supremacy that could last for generations. But here's the irony. The more urgent the situation becomes, the more likely it is that hasty decisions could lead to catastrophic mistakes. Stalin, facing the possibility that Germany could become invincible within months, starts preparing for a massive offensive that could either break German power or result in the destruction of the Soviet Union. Roosevelt, confronted with intelligence suggesting German rockets could reach American cities by 1945, begins considering military options that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. And Churchill, watching the British Empire crumble while German power grows, starts making diplomatic overtures that could reshape the entire global balance of power. By summer 1943, the world stands on the edge of decisions that will determine not just the outcome of World War II, but the entire future of human civilization. The chess game between the great powers is approaching its climax, and the moves made in the next few months will echo through history for generations. But even as political leaders are making calculations that could reshape the world, the ultimate question remains unanswered. What would this alternate timeline actually look like if it had continued? How would a world where Nazi Germany achieved technological supremacy have evolved? And what does this impossible history teach us about the world we actually inhabit? Those are the questions that will determine whether our story ends with hope or horror. So, here we are at the end of our incredible journey through an alternate timeline. And I have to tell you, the implications of what we've discovered together are absolutely staggering. We've followed this single decision, Hitler's choice not to invade the Soviet Union, ITPA, from that sweltering bunker in June 1941, all the way to a world that would have been unrecognizable to anyone living in our actual timeline. By 1945, in our alternate world, something unprecedented has happened. Picture this scene. The sun is setting over Berlin, and instead of Soviet tanks rolling through the rubble of a defeated Nazi capital, we see something entirely different. German rocket mail connects Berlin to Buenos Aires in 30 minutes. Atomic reactors power the Reich's factories. From the Channel Islands to the Caucasus, Nazi flags fly over an empire that seems genuinely unbreakable. But here's what I find most fascinating about this alternate world. It's not just different in military terms. It's different in ways that would have reshaped human civilization itself. Think about technology for a moment. In our real timeline, the space age began in the 1950s and 60s with American and Soviet competition. But in our alternate world, German rockets are already putting satellites into orbit by 1945. The first human beings in space are wearing German uniforms. The moon landing happens in 1955, and it's a Nazi flag that gets planted in the lunar dust. Here's what gives me chills when I think about this. The technological acceleration we've described isn't just military. German scientists, with unlimited resources and no immediate pressure from enemy action, are making breakthroughs across every field of human knowledge. Picture German medical researchers in 1946 using their advanced understanding of atomic physics to develop new cancer treatments. Picture German engineers using their rocket technology to revolutionize aviation and transportation. Picture German computer scientists, because, yes, they're developing primitive computers, creating information networks that won't exist in our real timeline for decades. But technology is just one piece of this alternate world. The geopolitical implications are equally mind-blowing. The Cold War, which defined the second half of the 20th century in our real timeline, takes on a completely different character when it's between a Nazi-dominated Europe and everyone else. Imagine the United States and Soviet Union, traditional enemies in our timeline, forced into an alliance against a common threat that seems technologically superior to both of them. Picture American and Soviet scientists working together in secret facilities, sharing research and resources to develop weapons that might be able to challenge German supremacy. And here's something really wild to consider. What happens to the process of decolonization? In our real timeline, World War II weakened European colonial powers so much that their empires crumbled within a few decades. But in our alternate world, where Germany controls Middle Eastern oil and has potentially linked up with Japanese forces in Asia, the European colonial system might have been strengthened rather than weakened. Picture an alternate 1960s where European colonial empires, backed by German technology and Japanese naval power, still control most of Africa and Asia. Picture independence movements facing not just conventional colonial forces, but advanced weapons systems that make conventional rebellion nearly impossible. But here's where our story gets really complex, because even in this alternate world where Nazi Germany seems to have achieved ultimate victory, history teaches us that no empire lasts forever. Every system of power, no matter how advanced or seemingly unbreakable, eventually faces challenges that test its foundations. Picture this scenario. By the 1950s, the first generation of Germans who grew up under Nazi rule are coming of age, but unlike their parents, who lived through the chaos of the Weimar Republic and the early struggles of the Nazi movement, these young Germans have only known prosperity and technological achievement. Here's what's fascinating about human nature. Success often breeds complacency, and technological advancement doesn't necessarily solve fundamental social and political problems. Even in our super-advanced alternate Germany, there would still be questions about individual freedom, about the rights of conquered peoples, about the sustainability of a system based on conquest and domination. Picture underground resistance movements in the 1950s and 60s that aren't just fighting with conventional weapons, but developing their own technological capabilities. Imagine a new generation of resistance fighters who understand German technology well enough to turn it against its creators. And here's something really intriguing to consider. What happens when the first generation of conquered peoples grows up with access to German education and technology? You can't maintain technological superiority forever. If you're teaching advanced science and engineering to millions of people, you're simultaneously trying to dominate. But even beyond these internal contradictions, our alternate world would face external challenges that could reshape everything. Picture the moment when American scientists, working with captured German technology and Soviet research, finally develop their own atomic weapons. Suddenly, the German monopoly on ultimate military power starts to crack. Or picture the scenario where Japanese technological development, accelerated by access to German research, eventually surpasses German capabilities. The Axis alliance that reshaped the world in the 1940s might become a source of conflict in the 1950s as former allies compete for technological and territorial supremacy. Here's what I find most thought-provoking about this entire alternate timeline in CD. It shows us just how contingent our actual history really was. Every major development that we take for granted, the United Nations, the Cold War, decolonization, the space race, the civil rights movement, the development of computer technology. All of these things happened the way they did, partly because of that single decision Hitler made in June 1941. Picture a world where the Holocaust continued unopposed for decades instead of years. Picture a world where democratic ideals were completely marginalized by technological authoritarianism. Picture a world where the scientific method was subordinated to political ideology, but backed by such overwhelming force that opposition seemed impossible. But here's what gives me hope, even when contemplating this nightmare scenario. 10. Human beings have an incredible capacity for adaptation, innovation, and resistance. Even in the darkest alternate timeline we can imagine, there would still be people fighting for freedom, still be scientists pursuing truth regardless of political pressure, still be individuals willing to sacrifice everything for the possibility of a better future. And that brings us to perhaps the most important lesson of our journey through this alternate history. By understanding what didn't happen, we gain a deeper appreciation for what did happen. Every Allied victory that seemed inevitable in hindsight was actually the result of countless individual decisions, strategic choices, and often pure luck. The D-Day landings that liberated Europe, they were possible partly because German forces were tied down fighting in Russia. The Manhattan Project that ended the war in the Pacific, it succeeded partly because German atomic research was disrupted by the chaos of fighting on multiple fronts. The alliance between democratic and communist nations that defeated fascism, it held together partly because everyone faced an immediate existential threat. Think about that for a moment. Our world, the world of international law, human rights, space exploration, computer, technology, global communication, AAS poem, exists partly because one megalomaniacal dictator made a strategically disastrous decision in the summer of 1941. But here's what I find most remarkable about this entire thought experiment. It doesn't make our actual history seem less important or less meaningful. Instead, it makes every victory against tyranny, every advance in human knowledge, every expansion of individual freedom seem more precious because we can see how easily things could have gone differently. The scientists who developed peaceful uses for atomic energy instead of just building bigger bombs. The political leaders who chose cooperation over conquest after World War II. The ordinary people who rebuilt democratic institutions instead of surrendering to authoritarian alternatives. All of these choices matter more, not less, when we understand how different the world could have been. And perhaps most importantly, our journey through this alternate timeline shows us that history isn't just something that happened to previous generations. History is being made right now by the decisions we make, the technologies we develop, the values we choose to defend or abandon. Every time we choose cooperation over conflict, every time we prioritize human rights over national power, every time we use technology to solve problems rather than create new weapons, we're helping to ensure that our actual timeline continues to diverge from the nightmare scenario we've explored together. The world that almost was serves as both a warning and an inspiration. A warning about how quickly human civilization can take dark turns when we stop paying attention to the values that make progress possible, and an inspiration to appreciate the world we actually inhabit, with all its flaws and challenges, because we can see how much worse things could have been. So the next time you read about international cooperation on climate change or medical research that saves lives regardless of national boundaries, or young people around the world connecting through technology to solve shared problems, remember this alternate timeline we've explored. Remember how different choices in the past created the possibility for better choices in the present. The summer, when history almost changed forever, reminds us that history is always changing, and the direction it changes depends on decisions that ordinary people make every single day. The butterfly effect that started in that bunker in June 1941 is still echoing through time, but now it's in our hands to determine what those echoes become. That's the real lesson of the path not taken. It illuminates the path we're walking right now, and it reminds us that every step matters more than we might ever know.